So I know I'm a little bit late to the party, and you've had your topic for a few weeks now, but it's been a busy couple of weeks for me. We had Vacation Bible School, and then two of my recent graduates asked me actually to perform their wedding, and that just went down over the last couple of days. So this is the first time I've really had a free minute to think about your topic, and reform foreign policy toward Russia. You do go in for big ones, don't you? Which I know is to a certain extent, that's kind of a product of the way topicality works in your league and judges' expectations about making topicality arguments. And if there are not going to be very evenly matched, very strategic, purely competitive motive topicality debates very often, if judges are not very amenable to that, then it's okay to write kind of broad topics without a lot of technical terms in them and assume that people will just kind of reach a consensus about what feels topical. Doesn't give you a lot of guidance about what to expect, though. I have just a few ideas from having coached occasionally on topics that were phrased as change foreign policy over the years, a few directions you might want to look, and a couple of ideas just out of my kind of quick survey of the literature and where it is right now when it comes to Russia and foreign policy. The first thing I think that you might want to think about is look for something that is a systemic change in foreign policy, a big overall umbrella change in our foreign policy toward Russia. And I'll give you a couple of examples from affirmatives that I've seen over the years. Years and years and years ago, over 20 years ago, we had a change foreign policy toward Africa topic, and Harvard had an affirmative that they started running during the December tournaments out in California, that it was about change our worldview in implementing our foreign policy in Africa. And coincidentally, it was chiefly about not Russia, but back then it was still the Soviet Union. And the idea was that people working in the State Department still had as their chief mission in life, as their operational priority, resisting communism by any and all means necessary, including just little short-term victories. And Harvard had actually quite good evidence that there were specific changes you could make into the staffing, into the mission documents, into how things worked that would actually serve to purge that worldview. And a lot of people try to make arguments that you can't fiat attitudes, and Harvard would say, we're not fiating attitudes. What's written into our plan is particular structural changes, and we read solvency evidence that that would be sufficient to change the organizational culture and to counterbalance the worldview of the people who've achieved senior status in the State Department. A second example of this, on the high school Russia topic from about a decade back, there were affirmatives that said that the United States had placed too much, we had staked too much of our foreign policy on dealing with Boris Yeltsin, who was the president at the time, and they had found evidence that said we needed to move away from a Yeltsin-centered foreign policy. So what both of those affirmatives did is not much that was really very specific. And so what would happen was negatives would then say that they would try to make arguments, they would try to figure out which directions to go with their negative strategies, with their generics, what to do with the relations arguments, maybe what to do with spending arguments or soft line against military threat arguments. And that left affirmatives free, because they had done the research to do this, to say in the 2AC, well, no, actually, the effect of the plan would be to go the opposite direction. So maybe the negative would say, well, that would be soft line, and that would erode U.S. military capability, and our allies wouldn't trust they were under our security blanket anymore, so it would lead to arms races, or it would lead to German prolif, or Japanese developing nuclear weapons, or just Japanese remilitarization, those kinds of arguments. And then affirmatives would say, well, no, actually, this particular reform would lead to the United States taking even a harder line stance and putting up an even more effective and very apparent security umbrella, so we link term those arguments. What a good systemic affirmative will do is it lets you hang back and not commit to whether the plan would result in spending more money, whether it would result in a perception of weakness. You can then take control of that debate after the negative has tried to commit, and because you're the one who did the research on your own affirmative, your evidence is likely to be better than whatever explanation they had in the first speech. Now, you might be thinking, well, I don't want to run an affirmative like that because if it doesn't really do anything, people will just run plan vagueness against me. Except that these plans, as written, have very specific mandates. It's just the kinds of things people will be carrying disadvantage links to, spending more money and so forth. Those plans don't do those sorts of things. You can still explain in great detail in the cross-examination of the 1AC what you do, and you can let them see the mandates of the plan, and they do specific things. It's just they're not the kinds of things that give the negative much of a toehold to make offensive arguments. And I have a couple of suggestions. In the Journal of International Affairs, the spring-summer 2010 issue, there's an article by a dude by the name of Jeffrey Mankoff. And he talks about generational change, that now in Russia, there's a whole generation that has grown up and is starting to take over the levers of power who never lived under the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union fell almost 20 years ago, which means the people who are just coming of age, just beginning to move into adulthood and move into professional careers, they were born around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, which means that United States foreign policy has to change in some systemic ways. You might check that out and see if that has potential, if what he puts in there as far as solvency evidence is good enough that you could write a systemic change affirmative out of that. Another possibility, there was a good-looking article in the journal Foreign Affairs in the September-October 2009 issue talking about the triangular relationship. And I'm going to talk again about the triangular relationship when we get to the negative, but it's the idea that the United States, and I'm sure you probably remember this from the India topic, the idea that the United States does not just have relations with Russia and does not just have relations with China, but that the United States plays the two off each other, and that those two nations do the exact same thing. Russia plays the United States off China and vice versa, and China plays Russia off the United States and vice versa. And all three nations try to maintain a fairly delicate balance in their relationship with their two counterparts. And so maybe what you do is maybe a good systemic change affirmative could be to adjust how our triangular relationship is set up. And maybe you make the argument that up until now, we've treated Russia as though they were the priority because they were the bigger superpower as far as having a strategic nuclear force and so forth. But maybe China has finally reached the critical mass where it has taken over and becomes a higher priority than Russia, which would be a change in foreign policy toward Russia. People might try to say that it's extra topical to change our foreign policy toward China at the same time. But if you say where Russia is in our hierarchy of priorities, that's the change. It, of course, changes how we deal with other nations as well, but every affirmative is going to do that. Every affirmative is going to take resources that would otherwise have gone to other parts of the world. Every affirmative will, by implication, change what we do with other nations. But you write the plan carefully enough, and the only thing it's going to do is change where Russia fits into those priorities. So, saying Russia is now a lower priority than China in the triangular relationship, that could be another systemic affirmative. You might look around and see, you might even find just that there's some good books written. Usually this is the kind of stuff that will come out of book research. It's very rare you're going to find it in newspaper research or think tank research, sometimes in think tank research. But often someone will write a book where they say there needs to be a re-evaluation of our stance toward Russia at the level of our most basic assumptions. And when you find one of those, you might have a good systemic change affirmative. A couple of other ideas. In the Boston College Third World Law Review, the spring 2009 issue, an article by, I think she's female, but a lady by the name of Yevgenia Shtilman, S-H-T-I-L-M-A-N. That looked like an affirmative that was pretty much, you would have out of that article and out of the footnotes from the article, the beginnings. And then you would just have to do a little spot research here and there, and you'd almost have a fairly neat-looking affirmative out of the box. The idea here is pharmaceutical companies in the United States used to go and test a lot of their new products in Africa, and they took a lot of heat for that, and there was a lot of rallying and a lot of agitation to put a stop for that, and all they've done is they picked up and moved to Russia. And there's a fair amount written in there about how some of the practices in testing our new, as of yet unapproved drugs on Russians violate medical ethics, violate the Nuremberg Code, and you could get some fairly good arguments about if you erode those ethical strictures, there's all kinds of just really horror story impacts that come about. And so the affirmative becomes very simple. Put a stop to testing our, as of yet, new and fairly dangerous pharmaceuticals on Russians. It feels in the gut like it's topical. It wouldn't link to a lot of the generics being run on the topic. It might link to improving U.S. relations with Russia, but you could, given that I think these pharmaceutical companies actually pay people to participate in the programs, you could probably go either way on that. On the one hand, it'd make the United States look better because we're not killing Russians with unproven drugs, but on the other hand, we're taking away a program that was providing valuable money to people who sometimes are having a hard time staying afloat. So you might be able to hold back until the 2AC and link turn whatever the negative wants to say about what the effect of the plan would be on relations with Russia.